2 million people trapped, the world's eyes fixated, and global leaders scrambling as hunger and bombs threaten to wipe out an entire city. Yet one question keeps burning. Why can't Israel and Hamas seal a ceasefire deal, even with billions in aid and the full force of U.S. diplomacy on the table? The answer is more complicated and more alarming than most media headlines dare to reveal. Because behind every headline, every negotiation table, and every aid convoy halted at the border, there's a tangled knot of money, power, and the relentless drive for survival. And right now, that knot is tighter than ever. Let's zoom out. For the past 19 months, Gaza has become a tragic symbol of deadlocked negotiations, unspeakable suffering, and, perhaps most staggering, a crisis that no amount of international pressure seems able to resolve. October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched a deadly assault on Israel, marked a historic escalation, plunging the region into relentless warfare. Since then, ceasefires have flickered and collapsed like dying embers. One deal after another emerges in headlines, only to fizzle out in bitter disagreement and renewed violence. But what's really at stake this time? Why are both sides refusing to budge, even as famine closes in and the world's most powerful leaders call for compromise? To understand the current deadlock, we need to break down the key demands and the stakes for each side. Let's start with Hamas. After months of bombardment and a crippling blockade, Hamas is pushing for conditions that go far beyond a simple temporary ceasefire. Their central demands? First, an ironclad guarantee of a permanent end to hostilities. Second, a full withdrawal of all Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip. Third, unrestricted movement for the people of Gaza, meaning free passage through the crucial Rafah crossing, and the unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid on a massive scale. And fourth, a sweeping restoration of Gaza's battered infrastructure, from electricity and water to bakeries and hospitals. These aren't just wish lists. For Hamas, these conditions are existential. As one senior Hamas official put it, "Our people cannot survive more broken promises. We need guarantees, not more empty words." Israel, for its part, sees things very differently. For Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, the war is about more than hostage exchanges and temporary truces. It's about the total defeat of Hamas, as a military threat, a governing force, even as a symbol. The Israeli position centers on three non-negotiable points: the return of all remaining hostages held since October 7th, the complete disarmament and dismantling of Hamas, and no full withdrawal that could allow Hamas to resurge and rearm. The chasm between these positions is enormous, and standing in the middle is the United States, once again stepping into the role of crisis mediator, with President Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff spearheading the latest round of proposals. But even U.S. leverage appears to be running thin. Witkoff called Hamas's response to the most recent U.S.-backed proposal totally unacceptable, warning that ongoing amendments and escalating demands could collapse the entire negotiation framework. Yet, astonishingly, both sides continue to talk. Behind the scenes, Egyptian and Qatari diplomats shuttle between delegations, piecing together ceasefire frameworks that dangle the promise of relief, but repeatedly collapse under their own contradictions. Here's where things get even more complex and more urgent. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza isn't just a backdrop to negotiations, it's the driving force behind the urgency and the intransigence. The United Nations describes Gaza as the hungriest place on earth. More than 2 million people, squeezed into a shrinking strip of land, face mounting hunger, disease, and displacement. The World Food Programme's recent statement was chilling. After nearly 80 days of a total blockade, communities are starving. They are no longer willing to watch food pass them by. On the ground, chaos reigns. Aid trucks are hijacked and looted by desperate groups as famine bites deeper. Infrastructure that once formed the spine of daily life, hospitals, water plants, bakeries, has been decimated by airstrikes. Israel's blockade, intended to weaken Hamas, has also paralyzed civilian life. And while limited aid trickles in, UN officials call it a mockery of the mass tragedy unfolding under our watch. Just to put numbers on the crisis, the World Food Programme estimates a minimum of $1 billion in emergency food and logistics is needed, now. Rebuilding basic infrastructure will cost at least $10 billion according to UN development experts. But none of this is possible without a ceasefire and safe passage for materials and workers. The stakes for both sides have never been higher. For Hamas, agreeing to anything short of full Israeli withdrawal and guarantees risks their political legitimacy, and, perhaps in their view, Palestinian survival. For Israel, conceding these points could mean the resurgence of a force they've vowed to eradicate. U.S. strategy faces a credibility crisis. Every failed round of talks weakens American influence across the region and fuels cynicism about Western diplomacy. Meanwhile, the hostages' plight hangs over the process like a shadow. In the latest U.S.-mediated proposal, Hamas offered to release 10 living hostages and return the remains of 18 deceased in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. But the group demands this process occur in gradual phases over 60 days, tying each stage to the delivery of aid and progress in negotiations. For Israel, this phased approach is seen as a lever for Hamas to prolong its survival and extract ever larger concessions from a desperate international community. The emotional toll is staggering. Israeli families of the hostages rally daily, pleading for their loved ones' release. Palestinian families in Gaza, meanwhile, queue for dwindling food rations under constant threat of airstrikes. International aid workers describe the scenario as a slow-motion catastrophe. The war isn't just fought with bombs and bullets, it's a war of narratives too. Hamas frames every demand as an issue of Palestinian rights, sovereignty, and survival. Israel, backed by the U.S., presents its campaign as a necessary response to terrorism and a just defense. The media battleground is relentless, shaping perceptions and hardening positions on both sides of the wall. So where does all this leave the prospects for peace? At this point, international mediators see three possible paths. First, a dramatic escalation. If talks fail and hostilities intensify, triggering even greater bloodshed and potentially drawing in regional powers. Second, a prolonged stalemate, with neither side able to impose its will, but millions of civilians suffering ongoing deprivation. Or third, a breakthrough, a durable ceasefire, contingent on both sides making painful compromises, and crucially, external stakeholders, especially the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar, providing credible guarantees. But each path is riddled with pitfalls. Experts warn that without addressing the root causes, sovereignty, security, and control over aid and reconstruction, the cycle of violence and humanitarian disaster is destined to repeat. As UN Relief Chief Philippe Lazzarini bluntly put it, the aid that's being sent now makes a mockery of the mass tragedy unfolding under our watch. But what about the behind-the-scenes economics? The $10 billion question remains. Who will pay for Gaza's reconstruction and under what political conditions? With international donors wary of funding projects that could be destroyed by renewed conflict, the financial lifeline is fraying. Meanwhile, U.S. political capital is on the line, with each failed negotiation undermining Washington's regional credibility. As we end this first half, the deadlock remains. Hostages' lives hang by a thread. Aid is blocked or stolen. Billions of dollars in infrastructure and humanitarian relief are ready, but trapped behind politics, fear, and mistrust. There's still time for a breakthrough, but also a very real chance that Gaza's future will be decided by force, not diplomacy. Here's the million-dollar question, literally. Can the world's power brokers untangle this knot before Gaza collapses entirely? Or is the region headed for an even darker turn, with catastrophic consequences for Israelis, Palestinians, and the stability of the entire Middle East? So, what does the deadlock in Gaza mean for the days and weeks ahead? Why do even the world's most powerful diplomats seem unable to budge the two sides, while a humanitarian disaster unfolds before our eyes? Let's look ahead at the possible scenarios, and what the latest fracture in ceasefire diplomacy might set in motion. First, the risk of outright escalation. With each failed round of negotiation, the chance of a larger flare-up grows. The Israeli military, buoyed by recent claims of eliminating top Hamas commanders, could push deeper, aiming to decisively crush what's left of Hamas's infrastructure. There are already reports of intensified airstrikes and ground operations. For Gaza's 2 million residents, more fighting means more displacement, more hunger, and more lives lost in the crossfire. But the cost isn't just measured in bombs and bullets. Aid agencies warn that every additional week of blockade is leaving Gaza the hungriest place on earth. The World Food Program has described convoys being looted by desperate crowds. One aid worker said, "People here don't just want peace, they want bread, they want water." Without a breakthrough, the status quo could harden into a grinding stalemate. This scenario, a siege with sporadic violence, limited humanitarian access, and no real path to peace, would prolong suffering and breed new grievances. A new generation, raised amid chaos, would see their futures wither. Economically, it would be a disaster not just for Gaza, but for the entire region. Reconstruction funds would dry up, international donors would grow weary, and Gaza could become a permanent humanitarian black hole. Some hope persists that high-stakes diplomacy might still break the cycle. President Trump's declaration that a deal is close could signal a last-minute twist, especially as global outrage over Gaza's suffering peaks. But even if a temporary truce is reached, a 60-day pause, a limited hostage exchange, the core issues remain unresolved. Hamas still insists on a permanent ceasefire and total Israeli withdrawal. Israel, in turn, demands the complete disarmament and dismantling of Hamas, along with the safe return of all hostages. Here's the uncomfortable truth. No deal is truly durable unless both sides address their fundamental fears. For Israel, it's the specter of Hamas regrouping and launching future attacks. For Hamas and many Palestinians, it's the ever-present threat of occupation, displacement, and being cut off from the basic necessities of life. There's also the wild card of regional actors. Egypt and Qatar, shuttling messages between the parties, have managed to keep some channels open. But with each day, their leverage diminishes as trust erodes. Meanwhile, the United States, traditionally the ultimate power broker, now faces accusations of bias from Hamas and doubts from its own allies. As one senior Palestinian official told Reuters, mediators can only do so much if the fundamental issues are left to rot. Let's pause for a moment. What if the ceasefire actually comes together, against all odds? That too carries risks and opportunities. For aid workers, it would mean a chance to flood Gaza with desperately needed supplies. Hospitals, nearly out of fuel and medicine, could stabilize. Families might finally reunite. But the ceasefire would only be a fragile reprieve unless it forms the foundation for something deeper. Without follow-up agreements and a roadmap toward a political settlement, Gaza could quickly slide back into conflict, as has happened so many times before. History is full of uneasy truces that collapsed when leaders failed to seize the moment. That's the shadow hanging over these talks. Unless there is direct progress on core demands, security guarantees for Israel, a credible promise of sovereignty and basic rights for Palestinians, any deal will be just another bandage on a festering wound. Looking at these scenarios, one thing becomes clear. The stakes are not just regional, they are global. Every failed negotiation chips away at the credibility of international law and humanitarian norms. The images from Gaza have already triggered protests in capitals worldwide, polarizing opinions and feeding new cycles of anger on social media. As UN official Philippe Lazzarini warned, the aid that's being sent now makes a mockery of the mass tragedy unfolding under our watch. So, what are the practical lessons from this deadlock? Why should viewers far from the Middle East care about the twists and turns of Gaza diplomacy? First, Gaza is a warning about the limits of raw power. Military might can shape the battlefield, but it cannot create peace on its own. Decisive victories are rarely as decisive as they look on TV screens. As one UN mediator put it, you can win every battle and still lose the war for hearts and minds. Second, the Gaza crisis is a lesson in the dangers of dehumanizing the enemy and ignoring the suffering of civilians. When starvation becomes a weapon and aid is seen as a threat, everyone loses. This isn't just a Middle Eastern story, it's about basic norms that protect us all, whether in Gaza, Ukraine, or anywhere conflict brews. Third, the deadlock highlights the crucial role of persistence in diplomacy. Even when negotiations seem hopeless, pressure from activists, journalists, and ordinary people can force leaders back to the table. International outrage over Gaza's suffering has already nudged some governments toward greater humanitarian concessions. What can you do with this information? For one, you can look past the sound bites and slogans. Understand the deeper fears and grievances that keep the sides apart. When you see the headlines about hostages, blockades, or aid convoys, remember the human faces behind them. If you want to make a difference, consider supporting impartial humanitarian organizations who work under fire to get aid in. Stay informed, share credible sources, and challenge misinformation. Raising awareness matters. Sometimes it can even change policy. Most importantly, don't give up hope. History teaches us that moments of darkness often precede unexpected breakthroughs. When public opinion shifts, when leaders feel the eyes of the world upon them, even entrenched positions can soften. Now let's circle back to the question we started with. Can any last-minute breakthrough save Gaza from sliding deeper into catastrophe? Or are even the world's most powerful players helpless in the face of this collapse? Here's what we know. A breakthrough is possible, but only if there's a shift in how diplomacy is done. That means moving away from maximalist demands and zero-sum tactics. It means focusing not just on stopping the guns, but on addressing the real fears and hopes on both sides: security for Israelis, dignity, and a livable future for Palestinians. This will require concessions that are painful for politicians and anger hardliners. As one expert said, real peace is made by brave leaders who risk their popularity to end the pain. The secret fact few outside negotiation rooms ever hear? Sometimes the smallest gestures, a single convoy allowed through, a single prisoner released, can start chains of trust that lead to broader deals. In Gaza, the difference between hope and despair might come down to just one brave decision on each side. We'll keep watching, and so should you. Share this story, educate your friends, and demand accountability from those in power. The world is not powerless, but it does require people like you to care, to pay attention, and to act. If you found this video insightful, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories shaping our world. Leave a comment with your thoughts.